The feeling of excitement we had when we decided to take a vacation to Mexico was undeniable. We were a group of close friends, just looking for a break from our busy lives, and the idea of renting a secluded cabin by a quiet lake seemed perfect. The locals we met in the nearby village, however, weren't so enthusiastic. When we asked for directions to the cabin, a strange silence fell over the place. Their faces grew pale, and whispers filled the air. Someone muttered a name we hadn't heard before, Llorona. We laughed it off, assuming it was just one of those ghost stories meant to scare tourists. We were wrong. The old woman at the store was the boldest of the locals, warning us with a shaky voice to stay away from the water at night. She claimed that La Llorona, the ghost of a weeping woman who had lost her children, haunted the lake, forever searching for her lost ones. She said if you hear her cries, it's already too late. It seemed silly to us at the time, just another tale to make the place sound more mysterious. We were far too excited about our vacation to let some old legend ruin it. So we ignored the warnings and made our way to the cabin. The road was long and winding, surrounded by thick trees and an eerie calmness that set in as we got closer to the lake. None of us said it aloud, but we all felt the same thing. Something didn't feel right about this place. The cabin was beautiful in its own rustic way, perched on the edge of a lake that stretched out like a mirror reflecting the sky. During the day, it seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. The water was still, and the air was heavy with silence. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just an unsettling calm. We unpacked, joked around, and started settling into our temporary home. It felt like a dream come true, at least for the first few hours. As the sun began to set, a creeping sense of unease settled in. The shadows from the surrounding trees stretched long and dark, and the once beautiful lake started to look different, more sinister. The stillness that felt calming in the daylight now felt suffocating, as though the air itself was holding its breath. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but none of us wanted to admit it. Nightfall came quickly, wrapping the cabin in complete darkness. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. But even that felt unnatural. It was as if the lake was alive, waiting for something. We tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was just our imaginations. After all, we were here to relax, not to get spooked by some silly ghost story. Still, there was something about the night that made us restless. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like something was waiting just outside, watching us. But we told ourselves it was nothing, just the wilderness playing tricks on our minds. Little did we know the real terror was just beginning. That first night, after dinner, we all gathered around the fireplace, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in since sunset. We started telling ghost stories to lighten the mood. One of our friends, Carlos, brought up the legend of La Llorona again. He had done some reading on it earlier and shared more details about the story. According to him, La Llorona was a mother who had drowned her own children in a fit of madness and was now cursed to wander lakes and rivers, weeping and searching for them for eternity. As he finished the story, a cold breeze swept through the cabin, though all the windows were closed. We laughed nervously, but a tension hung in the air. Then we heard it, faint but unmistakable, a soft crying sound coming from the direction of the lake. At first, we thought it was one of us trying to play a prank, but the look on everyone's faces said otherwise. The crying was distant, but it felt unnaturally close, as if it was echoing all around us. We went outside to investigate, armed with flashlights. The air was colder than before, biting into our skin. We stood by the edge of the lake, listening. The crying had stopped. The water was completely still, not even a ripple, which somehow made it worse. There was no wind, no movement, just silence. We told ourselves it must have been the wind or some animal, but deep down we knew that wasn't true. Later that night, as we all tried to sleep, one of our friends, Maria, woke up screaming. She said she had seen a woman in white standing by the lake in her dreams, crying softly. When she approached the woman, her face turned toward her, but the face was empty. Hollow eyes, pale skin, and a mouth twisted in agony. It was just a dream, we told her, just a nightmare. But her shaking voice and pale face made it clear that it felt real to her. We didn't say it, but none of us slept peacefully after that. The next day, we tried to shake off the eerie events of the previous night. The sun was shining, and for a brief moment, Everything seemed normal again. We convinced ourselves that the crying we had heard was nothing more than our minds playing tricks on us. But even as we tried to go about the day like nothing had happened, the uneasiness from the night before lingered. It started with small things we could easily explain away if we tried hard enough. Maria found wet footprints leading from the lake to the front door of the cabin. We all looked at them, confused, but quickly dismissed it. Maybe one of us had gone out early in the morning, gotten wet, and forgotten. That had to be it. But no one admitted to leaving the cabin. Then, while we were sitting outside having lunch, Carlos suddenly froze mid-sentence. His face went pale as he stared out at the lake. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the calm surface of the water. He swore he saw a woman standing at the far edge of the lake, dressed in white, but she had disappeared the moment we all looked. We laughed it off nervously, but I could see the fear in his eyes. As the day went on, more strange things began to happen. Objects in the cabin would move on their own, small things like a cup sliding across the table or a door creaking open without anyone touching it. It wasn't enough to fully scare us, but it was enough to make us uneasy. Then just before sunset, we heard the crying again. This time it was louder, closer, and unmistakably real. That night, the crying didn't stop. It grew louder and more intense as the hours passed. We huddled together in the cabin, trying to ignore it, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind, just the sounds of the lake. But deep down, we knew the truth. La Llorona was no mere legend. She was here, and she was getting closer. As the night wore on, the crying became unbearable. It was no longer a distant, haunting wail, but a sharp, sorrowful scream that seemed to pierce right through the walls of the cabin. We all felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on us, suffocating us with fear. Maria, who had been the most shaken since the first night, couldn't take it anymore. She stood up suddenly, her face pale and eyes wide with panic. "I can't stay in here," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to know what's out there." Despite the terror gripping us all, none of us could let her go alone. Armed with flashlights and whatever courage we could muster, we decided to head down to the lake. As we stepped outside, the air was colder than it should have been. The moonlight glistened off the water, and in the distance, the crying was louder than ever. It seemed to be coming from the far shore. We followed the sound, our footsteps slow and uncertain. Every rustle of the wind made us jump, but we pressed on, determined to put an end to this nightmare. And then, we saw her. Standing at the edge of the lake was a figure in white. Her long dress flowed in the wind, and her dark hair hung over her face, dripping with water. She was weeping softly, her shoulders shaking with each sob. The air around her felt heavy, thick with sorrow and despair. We stopped in our tracks, frozen by the sight. This wasn't a figment of our imaginations. She was real. Carlos, perhaps braver or more foolish than the rest of us, took a step closer. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The woman didn't answer. Slowly, she turned her head, revealing her face. It was gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow and black, filled with endless grief. Her lips moved, whispering something we couldn't hear at first. We strained to listen, and then we heard it, a chilling, heart-wrenching plea. "Mis hijos, where are my children?" The words sent a cold shiver down our spines. It was La Llorona. The legend was true, and she was standing right in front of us. Carlos took another step toward her, but before any of us could stop him, her crying turned into a scream, loud and piercing, filled with anguish and rage. In an instant, she lunged at him, her bony hands reaching out. Carlos stumbled backward, terror in his eyes, as we all screamed and ran for the cabin. The door slammed shut behind us, but the crying didn't stop. It was all around us now, echoing through the walls, as if La Llorona herself had followed us inside. The temperature dropped, and objects began to shake violently. We had awakened something that wasn't going to let us go. Inside the cabin, chaos took over. The walls seemed to shake with the force of La Llorona's screams, and the cold had become unbearable. The crying, louder now, was all around us, coming from every corner of the cabin. We locked the doors, but deep down, we knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there wasn't something we could keep away with locks and bolts. Maria was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands over her ears as if trying to block out the sound. Carlos sat in a corner, his face pale, muttering that she had spoken to him, that La Llorona had called him by name. We were all too terrified to respond, our minds barely able to process what was happening. The once cozy cabin now felt like a prison, trapping us with a force far beyond our understanding. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. The air grew thick with dread. We heard footsteps, wet, heavy footsteps, slapping against the wooden floor, though none of us were moving. Something was inside the cabin with us. A shadow darted past the windows, and we heard a soft, heart-wrenching song from somewhere deep within the house. In the dim light, we could see the furniture shaking. The chairs scraped across the floor, and the windows rattled violently. It was as though the entire cabin was being pulled into her grief, twisted by the force of her sorrow and rage. Every time we heard her crying, it felt as though it was growing closer, suffocating us. Then, without warning, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that made us all jump. The lake water had risen unnaturally high, flooding the cabin floor. The once calm and serene water now churned wildly, as if it had come alive with her fury. We tried to shut the door, but it was no use. The water kept pouring in, icy and thick. In the distance, through the open door, we saw her again, La Llorona, standing at the water's edge, her hair soaked and hanging over her ghostly face. She was closer this time, her cries louder, more desperate, as she reached out toward the cabin with her bony, pale hands. "Mis hijos," she sobbed. "Where are my children?" In that moment, we realized the full weight of the curse we had stumbled into. La Llorona wasn't going to stop until she claimed one of us. She was searching, and we were her targets. Each of us was a reminder of what she had lost, and now she would make us pay. As the water rose around our ankles, panic set in. We tried to barricade the door, but it was hopeless. La Llorona's presence felt suffocating, like the very air around us was drowning in sorrow. Her cries echoed louder and louder, and no matter where we turned, we could hear her voice calling for her children. The cabin itself felt like it was closing in on us, trapping us with her. Suddenly, Maria stood up, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "She's here," she whispered, pointing toward the doorway. We all turned, and there she was, La Llorona, standing just inside the cabin now, her white dress drenched, her long black hair clinging to her face. Her hollow eyes locked onto us, and her mouth opened in a silent scream before the sound ripped through the air, deafening and filled with unimaginable grief. Without thinking, Carlos bolted for the back door, but as soon as he reached it, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping us inside. We were cornered. La Llorona floated closer, her bony fingers outstretched. We backed away, but the water was rising fast, slowing us down. Every step we took felt like moving through quicksand, and her figure glided effortlessly toward us, her weeping never stopping. "Leave us alone," I shouted, but my words felt meaningless against the overpowering force of her sorrow. She wasn't listening. She didn't care. In her mind, we were no longer people. We were stand-ins for her lost children, and she was coming to take us. Carlos, desperate, tried to speak to her. "Please, we're not your children," he cried. But La Llorona stopped in front of him, her face inches from his. Her empty eyes bore into his, and for a brief moment, her cries softened. She reached out and touched his cheek, her cold fingers leaving a trail of water. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, she grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward the door. His scream filled the cabin as we watched in horror, frozen in fear. Carlos fought, but it was no use. Her strength was inhuman. She dragged him outside into the rising lake, and in an instant, they both disappeared beneath the water's surface. We were too terrified to move. The lake outside had calmed, eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. But Carlos was gone. The sobbing had stopped, and all that remained was the deathly silence. We knew we couldn't stay. We gathered ourselves and fled the cabin at first light, leaving everything behind. As we drove away, none of us spoke. The only sound was the engine and our own rapid breathing. But just as we reached the edge of the village, I heard it again. The faint, heart-wrenching cry of La Llorona, still searching, still weeping, and I knew deep down that she wasn't done. Even as we drove away from the cabin, the terror didn't leave us. The memory of Carlos being dragged into the dark, icy waters haunted us, and none of us could shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The silence in the car was heavy, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The village behind us was shrinking from view, but in our minds, La Llorona's cries were still echoing. We made it back to the town we'd driven through on our way to the lake, hoping to find help, someone to explain what we'd just experienced. When we reached the small hotel where we had stayed the first night, we stumbled inside, frantic, our clothes still wet from the rising lake water. The receptionist looked at us, concerned as we tried to tell him what had happened. But when we mentioned La Llorona, his face grew pale, and he shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone there," he muttered, almost to himself. "No one goes to that lake anymore. Not after all the disappearances." Our blood ran cold. Disappearances? He explained that over the years, people who had visited the cabin near the lake had vanished without a trace. La Llorona, the weeping woman, was no mere legend. She had been taking people, tourists, locals, anyone who got too close to the water at night. She was forever searching for her children, and anyone who crossed her path became a part of her sorrow. We left the hotel in a daze, numb with fear and grief. Carlos was gone, and there was no bringing him back. The weight of it settled heavily on our shoulders. As we prepared to leave town, our bags hastily packed. We heard it again, faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft, distant cry, like the wind carrying a broken-hearted wail. La Llorona's voice. We hurried to the car, desperate to escape. But as we drove away, the crying only grew louder, following us. It was as if she had latched onto us, her sorrow now part of our lives, a shadow we couldn't outrun. The further we drove, the more hopeless it felt. We thought we had escaped her, but La Llorona wasn't finished with us. She would never stop searching. And now she had marked us. The crying, faint at first, grew louder in my ears as I realized something terrifying. We had left the lake, we had left the village, but La Llorona was with us. Wherever we went, her sorrow would follow. We could never escape her cries, no matter how far we ran.